That's not part of the story. I just wanted to do that. Welcome to the Old Leic Theater. And we're going to talk about the Old Leic Theater in just a minute, but I got to go back to the 1890s. The 1890s in New York City, a little baby was born, and the mama died giving birth. Everett Jones. So it was just Everett and his dad in New York City. And Everett's dad worked hard. He tried to put food on the table. He worked long hours. But he was the kind of dad that would come home from work and he'd go in Everett's room and he'd read stories to Everett. Fairy tales and folk tales, children's books, whatever books he could get his hands on, he would read to Everett every night. Well, Everett grew. And when he turned 3 years old, it's not very old, but you see, Everett had to grow up fast because of their situation. And Everett's dad came home and he said, Everett, I've been saving my nickels and dimes and pennies. That's the money we used to use when we were kids, nickels and dimes and pennies. And he saved those. He said, I've got a treat for you today on your 3rd birthday. And he said, get your coat on. We're going to go out. And Everett was excited because they never went out. They could never afford to do anything. And they walked through the streets of New York and they went into a theater. And Everett's dad had bought tickets to a live performance. Everett was mesmerized. He loved watching the actors. The stage was magical to him. You could become whoever you wanted up here on stage. You could go anywhere you wanted up here on stage. Year after year on Everett's birthday, Dad would save his nickels and dimes, and he would buy tickets, and they'd go to the live theater. Everett looked forward to it every year. On Everett's 13th birthday, his dad said, I'm home. Get your coat, we're going to go to the theater. And Everett was excited. And they went to the theater, but when they got home, Everett's dad said, here for a minute. And he went into his room and he brought out a package wrapped in brown paper. A sack from the store, really. And Everett opened it up, and it was a big, thick book. It was the complete works of William Shakespeare. And Everett thought, this is awesome. Everett went to bed early that night so he could start reading. And he turned each page and he fell in love with every word that William Shakespeare penned. And after about a week or so, he'd read the complete works of William Shakespeare. But he fell madly in love with the play Hamlet. And that's what he focused on, night after night. He read it. He reread it. He memorized every word. But he didn't just memorize words. He memorized inflections and feeling and emotion that went with the play. And he'd go over that every night. And he went to a 5 and dime store one day. Now, a 5 and dime store for you younger people, that means it costs 5 cents or 10 cents. Kind of like the dollar store, that's really the $1.25 store today. But he went there and he picked up a paper mache skull so that he could practice his lines in Hamlet. And he took that skull everywhere. It was his friend. He talked to it. Everywhere he went, you could see him on the streets late at night in New York, walking down the sidewalk, holding the skull up and saying, to be or not to be? That is the question. People would walk by and they'd shake their heads. They'd say, oh, Everett's crazy. That kid with the skull. He'd take it to school. He took it everywhere. But as he grew a little bit older, His dad was really struggling to make ends meet. And Everett decided that he better get a job to help with the family finances. So he went to stores and shops, and he asked if he could sweep the floors, if he could stock the shelves, whatever, just for a little bit of money. And his first job, he was sweeping the floors. And then he set the broom aside, and he got his skull out, and he started repeating all the lines in Hamlet. To be or not to be. And the shopkeeper came out and said, not to be. If you're not going to sweep, I'm not going to pay you. Job after job after job he got fired from. Because he took the skull everywhere. One night, when the shopkeeper had literally let him go, he was walking down the dark streets of New York City with the glowing street lamps, and he walked past a brick wall. And he looked up and plastered posters all over the brick wall. Audition, traveling troupe of actors for Hamlet. He was so excited, he ran all the way home. He told his dad was so excited for him. That night he went and he opened up the complete works of Shakespeare to Hamlet, and he started to read. He didn't need to read. He just went over the lines every night, over and over, every feeling, every inflection. The night of the audition came, and Everett was the first one there. There was a row of chairs outside where they would audition, and he sat down, and one by one, others would come that would audition. And Everett sat there with his skull. I hope it goes okay. He talked to his skull. It was a little weird. But one by one, they called him back to audition. Everett was the second to last to audition for the part. And he went in, and he had his skull, and he started reciting the lines from Hamlet with such feeling and such emotion. If you'd been there, you would have been weeping. It was so wonderful and beautiful, and he felt so confident. And they excused him after he was done. He went out and he was thinking, I got the part. This is my dream come true. This is my dream come true. I'm going to be Hamlet, my lifelong dream. And they all waited, and they waited, and they waited. And then they opened the door and they said, Everett, will you come on back? We want to talk to you. He's like, oh, this is it, Hamlet. He went in and sat down, and they said, Everett, we have a part for you. He's like, I know what part it is, Hamlet. They said, the part we have for you is we want you to be the second gravedigger. The first gravedigger has some lines. The second gravedigger has no lines. Everett was devastated. It was a slow walk home. He didn't even talk to his skull. He was so depressed. And he got home, and with tears streaming down his cheeks, he said, Dad, they gave me the part of second gravedigger. And his dad started to weep. And he hugged him and held him. And Everett said, Dad, I'm going to be the best second gravedigger in the history of Hamlet. I'm going to do this. I have a part. The next morning, he went to the Five and Dime again. He got some more paper mache skulls and some bones. And he put them in a bag. And opening night, he was backstage with the first gravedigger, Arthur Villers. He had lines. And when their time came to come out, you see the gravediggers were kind of the comic relief to a very serious play. And when it was time for them to come out, Everett spilled those bones onto the stage, and he came out, he tripped over them, and he turned and he made facial expressions that were more expressive than any lines that were ever said in the play. The crowd went crazy. They loved it. In fact, after the play, you know how actors line up as you go out the back door after a play? They were all lined up there, and they kept stopping at Everett and shaking his hand, said, "That was so incredibly funny. You are so talented." And Arthur Villers, the first gravedigger, was right next to him. No one shook his hand. No one said anything to Arthur. And night after night after night, the people would stop and they'd pat Everett on the back, and they just loved him. But Arthur Villers, nothing. And then they went on tour. They went to Iowa and Ohio and Kansas and up to Michigan. And then they went to Colorado. What's interesting is Arthur Villers was the first one to get the papers after the night of the play, because they'd have reviews in the newspaper. Kids, that's what we used to do. That's where we got our news, was the newspaper. It was a paper that you had to actually read. But Arthur would read through these articles and these reviews, and his name was never mentioned. Everett's was. In some of the articles, the guy playing Hamlet wasn't even mentioned. It was Everett. He was getting all the attention, and Arthur was getting so angry and so jealous that his blood began to boil. Oh. Their next stop was here in Logan, the old Leic Theater. The reason they came here is because the Thatcher Opera House had burned down, and this had recently opened up. And they came and they got set up. And that opening night here in Logan, Everett got a standing ovation. Arthur was so angry and so jealous, his blood boiled and boiled until his heart was cooked. He thought, I got to get rid of Everett. He's got to go. Now, the next night of the performance, after the performance, you see Everett would stay after every night. He'd be the last one to leave the theater because he would practice his lines of all of Hamlet up on stage. And he'd get the skull. The acting troupe had a real human skull. It was very authentic. And he had that real human skull backstage against the curtains. And he was going through his lines. But Arthur Villers was behind the curtain. To be or not to be. And Arthur carefully opened the curtains. Not to be! And he stabbed him in the side, and then he stabbed him in the neck. And Everett slumped over into a pool of dark red blood, as red as the curtains. But you see, when he stabbed him, Everett dropped the skull. And almost in slow motion, it fell and shattered into 1,000 pieces. Arthur didn't miss a beat. He went and got an old tarp from backstage, wrapped Everett's body up, got a mop and a bucket, cleaned up the blood, swept up the bone bits, discarded them. And then he dragged Everett's body backstage, down the stairs, down deep. And then if you go downstairs, it goes clear to where the road is. Now, Logan is crisscrossed with underground tunnels. They used to use them to deliver coal and merchandise, and occasionally a polygamist would get to the train station safely through these tunnels. And Villers thought, I'm going to bury him in this tunnel right here. No one will ever find him. So he dragged him down into the tunnel, and he kind of dug out the side of the tunnel, and he stuffed Everett's body in that tarp, in that little crevice, and he started to stack rocks, dirt. And then Arthur thought, oh, they're going to know something happened. The skull is missing. So he pulled the rocks down, and he took his knife, and he severed the head of Everett. And he put Everett's head in a bag. And then he sealed up the headless body. He carried that back through the tunnel, back out, and went to his hotel room. It was a small little hotel room, but it had a 2-burner stove, and some pots and pans, and some utensils, and there was a big pot. And Arthur went and filled that big pot full of water, and he turned that stove on, and he opened the bag, and he put the head of Everett Jones in that boiling water. And he boiled that head all night long. Little clumps of hair would float up to the top, and he'd scrape it off the top of the water. Little bits of cooked flesh would float up to the top, and he'd scrape it off and discard it. He carefully lifted the head up by what hair was left, and he got one of the spoons, and he scooped out the eyeballs. I'm not making this up. By morning, his windows in the hotel room were steamed over, and he took that gleaming white skull back to the theater here. They were cleaning up, they were packing up, they had to go to their next location on the tour. And he walked in and he started helping. And they said, Arthur, where's Everett? We haven't seen Everett. He said, I don't know. I haven't seen him. But by the way, I noticed our old skull was getting dirty and dingy. So I spent the night cleaning the skull. And he held up the white gleaming skull. And for the first time ever, they thanked Arthur. Thank you so much for cleaning that skull. That must have taken you forever. And they left and went on the tour. Everett got to play in Hamlet quite a bit. Now Everett's still here. In fact, as you go out tonight, some of you went to the restrooms, right there's a framed playbill. And if you look, Hamlet, first gravedigger is Arthur Villers, second gravedigger is Everett Jones. And that's the last time anyone saw Everett. Now, when they dug up Center Street to do all the new stuff, they found fragments of human bone. But Everett's still here. USU runs the Leic Theater, and the director at USU has stories collected throughout the years. One time there was a small fire on backstage, and people were freaking out, and they said they saw a young man dressed in Shakespearean garb run across the stage, put the fire out, and then he disappeared. On the catwalk above the stage, a dark figure would walk across. Many times as they closed up the theater, they would watch a young man in Shakespearean clothing walk up the stairs to go to the balcony. And they'd go up and there'd be no one there. One night, as one of the students was closing up, she was turning off the lights down in the basement from the back to the front. And as she turned the front one off, one by one, in reverse order, the lights turned back on. And she went back and she turned them off one by one. And again, reverse order, they turned back on. She finally yelled out, Everett, knock it off. I gotta go home. And she went and she turned the lights out and they stayed off. Many that have come to productions here at this theater will tell you they've heard Everett laugh, or clap, or kind of groan when the lines are messed up. There's a seat right up in the balcony, right up here. RL1, right on the left in the front. They never sell a ticket for that seat. That's Everett's seat. So if you ever come to a production, look up in that seat and see if you can hear something like laughter or clapping. And if you're lucky, You may even hear, to be or not to be. Ah!